Hey there. Welcome to Ancient After Dark. This is Nathaniel, and tonight I'll be your companion as we travel quietly into the misty world of the samurai, the silent warriors of ancient Japan, men who could spend an entire morning arranging flowers and an entire afternoon slicing through bamboo targets with absolute serenity. Tonight we won't rush. We'll breathe with their rhythm. We'll move through temples and battlefields, through the hush of training halls and the echo of swords drawn only when necessary. So settle in, adjust your blanket, and let's begin this slow journey through the land where honor, discipline, and impermanence walked hand in hand. When we picture the samurai, we often imagine armor gleaming under cherry blossoms, tall helmets shaped like horns, and blades polished until they could reflect the moon. But their world was not built on spectacle. It was built on silence, discipline, and an unspoken promise that one's life was already given away the moment the sword was taken up. In that sense, the samurai were professional philosophers who happened to carry very sharp reminders of mortality. Long before the word samurai meant warrior, it meant servant, a person who attended another. The early samurai were retainers of the noble clans during Japan's Heian period, roughly 1,000 years ago. They were the problem solvers of the aristocracy, riding through muddy provinces to collect taxes, defend borders, or occasionally remind peasants why taxes were best paid promptly. It wasn't glamorous, but over generations, this class of servants evolved into the military backbone of Japan's rising clans. If you'd met one of these early warriors, he probably would have been polite enough to bow before testing his bowstring. They carried longbows far more than swords, and often fought from horseback. Imagine that. Centuries before the katana became legend, the symbol of a warrior's pride was a curved piece of wood and a quiver full of persuasion. As Japan drifted through civil conflict, these warriors grew in power, forming alliances, serving lords known as daimyo, until the emperor himself became more decoration than decision-maker. By the 12th century, the samurai had taken over the business of running Japan, which mostly involved making sure no one else tried to run Japan. Their rise was marked by what historians call the Genpei War, a decades-long feud between two great clans, the Taira and the Minamoto. If you've ever fought with family over inheritance, imagine that, but with more armor and slightly higher stakes. The Minamoto eventually triumphed, establishing Japan's first shogunate, a military government that would last, in one form or another, for nearly 700 years. At the top of this new order stood the shogun, below him, the daimyo, and under them, the countless samurai who pledged loyalty not to an emperor in silk, but to a lord in steel. Their loyalty was absolute, or at least it was supposed to be. History suggests a few samurai occasionally adjusted their definition of absolute when promotions were involved. Still, the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, emerged as a moral compass, not a written law, but a set of ideals whispered across generations. Honor, loyalty, courage, self-control, and the ability to remain calm when someone was trying to separate you from your calm. Bushido wasn't about winning. It was about being worthy of the sword you held. Their armor reflected this paradox, lacquered plates of metal and silk, designed not only to protect but to move gracefully. Many pieces were painted in colors chosen to reflect inner balance, or occasionally to terrify anyone lacking such balance. You might say their fashion sense was lethal. And then, of course, came the sword, the katana, forged in rituals that bordered on sacred. The smith would purify himself before forging, praying as he folded the steel again and again. Each fold compressed impurities until the blade became both weapon and prayer. To the samurai, drawing it was a final answer, a last word in a conversation best avoided. If you listen closely, every katana has its own whisper. That might sound poetic, but metallurgically speaking, it's the resonance of layered steel. Still, the samurai believed it was the spirit of the sword speaking back, reminding them that every cut was an act of consequence. When not fighting, they trained endlessly. Some practiced archery until their fingers bled. Others meditated in gardens until they forgot the difference between wind and thought. It's worth remembering, this was a culture that believed the proper arrangement of rocks could reveal the secrets of the universe. Compared to that, swordsmanship seemed almost simple. But for every samurai meditating under a pine tree, there was another checking if his lord had remembered to pay him on time. Loyalty, after all, was spiritual. But rice was practical. Many samurai supplemented their income by farming, teaching, or occasionally writing poetry about how much they disliked farming and teaching. During peacetime, the samurai became administrators and scholars, running villages, managing taxes, overseeing irrigation systems. The warrior who once led charges now led meetings, proving that bureaucracy is the most enduring battlefield of all. Their wives, often overlooked in romanticized stories, were formidable in their own right. Samurai women managed estates, trained in self-defense, and upheld the same stoic discipline expected of their husbands. Some even took command when their lords were absent, ensuring that the household remained both honorable and terrifyingly efficient. You might wonder what it felt like to live with a code that demanded such control. to never show fear, to never cry out in pain, to always appear composed even in defeat. It sounds exhausting, but to the samurai, composure was freedom, because emotions were seen as chains that could lead a man to dishonor. Their entire philosophy rested on a quiet acceptance of impermanence, much like watching cherry blossoms fall, beautiful because they cannot last. The influence of Zen Buddhism deepened this philosophy. Samurai monks practiced meditation alongside sword forms, learning that stillness and motion were not opposites, but the same act viewed at different speeds. One might say they trained to strike without thought, which is still the goal of many modern meetings. Perhaps the most striking paradox of the samurai world was its beauty. Imagine a morning fog drifting through Kyoto, temple bells ringing in the distance, a warrior sitting before a small shrine, writing a death poem, not because he expects to die that day, but because he wishes to be ready. That kind of calm cannot be faked. It has to be lived. Art flourished under this mindset. Calligraphy, tea ceremony, gardening, and poetry became extensions of martial discipline. The same precision used to strike an opponent was used to pour tea without a ripple, or to arrange flowers so perfectly that they resembled a frozen moment of wind. Even destruction was treated as art, the art of letting go. Not all samurai lived by these ideals. Some were opportunists, some were mercenaries, and some, frankly, were terrible poets. But the myth survived because enough of them believed in it sincerely. Enough practiced restraint even when the world urged them toward chaos. Over time, their image became Japan itself. The samurai spirit lingered through centuries of political change, shaping not only warfare but etiquette, architecture, and even modern work culture. The reverence for precision, loyalty, and quiet endurance can still be felt in the hum of every city street. But our journey tonight is only beginning. Beyond the code and the calm lies the heart of contradiction. How a people so devoted to peace within could create an age defined by war without. How a sword could symbolize both compassion and cruelty, and how the most silent warriors in history still echo louder than any empire they served. So for now, let the sound of the bamboo in the wind carry you. Imagine the rustle of silk armor, the distant rhythm of taiko drums fading through the mist, and the breath of a samurai sitting perfectly still beneath a moonlit sky, waiting for dawn that always comes, but never too soon. After the Genpei War, Japan settled uneasily into the rule of the Kamakura shogunate. It was a strange kind of peace, the kind that hums with unfinished business, like a sword left half drawn. The samurai, once roaring into battle, found themselves adjusting to a quieter duty, maintaining order, collecting taxes, and occasionally reminding distant provinces who really held the power. For the first time, Japan was truly ruled not by the throne, but by the sword, and those who carried it began to realize that ruling a country was far less glorious than winning one. Paperwork, it turns out, can dull even the sharpest blade. Still, the samurai spirit thrived. Their training halls, called dojo, became places where young warriors learned not just to fight, but to think, to breathe, to exist within balance. The wooden floors echoed with the rhythm of bare feet and practiced swords. Every strike began and ended in silence. Every gesture was measured, deliberate, as though the body were writing poetry on the air. The greatest teachers were not the loudest, but the calmest. Masters who could strike a student down with a single motion, then offer tea immediately after. It was not cruelty. It was education. The kind that taught you to bow before both victory and defeat. The concept of duel, or kenjutsu, emerged as both art and ritual. Two warriors facing each other in a clearing. The sound of cicadas the only audience, each waiting for the other to blink, to breathe wrong, to think too soon. Sometimes duels ended before a single cut was made. The point was not always to kill, but to see who understood stillness best. Even the act of not fighting could be honorable, though explaining that to your lord afterward often required creative phrasing. As the centuries passed, the samurai became as much scholars as soldiers, their libraries filled with texts on ethics, poetry, and Zen philosophy. The Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi would later become a kind of spiritual manual, blending tactics, intuition, and art into one long meditation on perception. Musashi himself was a legend, a man who fought over 60 duels and won them all. Though by most accounts he wasn't much for manners or bathing. His method was simple: strike first, think later. His genius, however, was his mind. He saw swordsmanship not as fighting, but as seeing, learning to read the world as one would read the rhythm of a stream. You can still feel his presence in Japan, in statues, scrolls, and in the quiet hum of every sharpened blade. Around the same time, Zen monasteries began to open their doors to samurai seeking peace between battles. Imagine a warrior arriving at dawn, laying his sword at the temple gate, sitting cross-legged in silence for hours, letting the wind and his breath become one. Some found enlightenment. Others found that enlightenment was suspiciously similar to boredom, but both paths required patience. And that was the point. It was in this balance between violence and meditation that the samurai became something more than soldiers. They became symbols of discipline, reflections of a nation learning to find peace in precision. But peace, as always, is an invitation for ambition. By the 15th century, Japan had fallen into the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, when every warlord dreamed of uniting the country under his banner. and every samurai carried the weight of someone else's dream. For nearly 200 years, Japan fractured into endless conflict. Armies clashed across rice fields and mountain passes. Castles rose and fell like waves, and loyalty became a currency as unstable as the seasons. It was during this chaos that names like Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu rose from obscurity to legend. Nobunaga was brilliant, ruthless, and fond of gunpowder. Hideyoshi, the son of a peasant, became the shogun through sheer willpower. And Tokugawa, patient, strategic, and impossibly calm, would build an empire that lasted 2.5 centuries. They each embodied a side of the samurai ideal. Nobunaga, the storm; Hideyoshi, the fire; Tokugawa, the stone. Together, they ended an age of chaos by mastering what the samurai had always sought: balance between motion and stillness. Though they achieved it mostly by exhausting everyone else. During these wars, the samurai were tested not only on the battlefield, but within themselves. When battles stretched for years, loyalties blurred. Men who once served together found themselves on opposite sides, and the code of Bushido bent under the weight of survival. Still, the myths endured. A samurai would rather die by his own hand than live without honor. That act, called seppuku, became the ultimate declaration of integrity. To outsiders, it seemed horrifying. To the samurai, it was artful control, a way of choosing the terms of one's end, of writing the final verse of one's poem before the ink ran dry. It was this obsession with control over life, over death, over emotion, that made the samurai both admired and feared. Even their enemies often bowed before them, not out of surrender, but out of respect for their restraint. In those centuries, the land was alive with contrast. Cherry blossoms blooming beside burning villages, temple bells ringing over battle cries, monks tending gardens while generals drew maps of destruction. The samurai lived in a world constantly reminding them that beauty and impermanence were the same thing. When Tokugawa Ieyasu finally unified Japan in the early 1600s, the world of the samurai changed forever. The wars ended, the swords were sheathed, and for the first time in generations, peace became the new battlefield. Imagine being a warrior whose entire life was built around combat, and suddenly being told there was nothing left to fight. For many, it was like being a musician in a world that no longer believed in sound. So the samurai turned inward. They became teachers, poets, and bureaucrats. They taught their sons how to write, how to bow, and how to calculate taxes that once would have funded their armor. Some grew nostalgic, polishing swords they would never again draw, while others found meaning in philosophy, in the way of doing rather than the act itself. tea ceremony became a discipline, each movement deliberate, every gesture meaningful. Pouring tea slowly became the new duel. A perfect pour was an act of control, a reflection of spirit. And if the tea spilled, well, that was a reminder that perfection, like life, always slips through our fingers eventually. Their gardens became metaphors for their minds, stones arranged in flowing patterns, moss allowed to grow just enough to appear effortless. Each placement, each shape, spoke of patience, of a man who could see eternity in a handful of sand. Art and poetry thrived under their quiet gaze. The haiku, brief and delicate, suited them perfectly. 17 syllables to describe a lifetime. A samurai might spend a week composing 3 lines about the sound of rain, then ride into battle the next morning with the same calm precision. The shogunate imposed order. The samurai maintained it. And Japan closed its doors to the outside world, sealing itself into a timeless reflection of its own ideals. Yet under this surface peace, restlessness remained. The young samurai, raised on stories of glorious ancestors, found themselves writing reports instead of histories. Their swords symbolic, their battles replaced by etiquette. You could almost hear them sighing between sips of tea, wondering whether enlightenment was really worth the overtime. But peace, once again, did what war could not. It forced the samurai to face themselves. Without enemies to fight, they discovered the subtler struggles within, the battle against pride, against desire, against boredom. Their strength became internal, their sharpness philosophical. In temples across Japan, samurai meditated beside monks, learning to master the art of doing nothing with absolute discipline. In this stillness, Bushido transformed from battlefield creed to life philosophy. It became a mirror for the human condition, reminding its practitioners that courage wasn't in killing, but in facing the quiet moments without distraction. There's a lesson there, one that still feels relevant 1,000 years later. We live faster now, louder, but the samurai would probably tell us the same thing they told each other. Slow down, sharpen less, polish more. The sword is not for every fight. Sometimes it's enough just to sit and breathe. The Tokugawa peace lasted longer than anyone expected, and for generations, the samurai became both guardians and relics, respected, yet slowly fossilizing in ritual. They maintained the illusion of readiness in a world that had quietly outgrown their need. But deep within the echo of their dojos, and beneath the calm surface of their tea, the old spirit endured, waiting, as though the soul of Japan itself was holding its breath. For now, let the candlelight of their halls flicker in your mind, the faint scent of tatami mats and incense in the air, a scroll of calligraphy unrolling across the floor. And somewhere, a master corrects a student's stance, not with anger, but with a whisper. Balance is not in the sword, it's in the silence before you draw it. And with that silence, we drift onward, toward the twilight of the samurai, when the world around them would begin to change faster than even their discipline could hold, when the sound of ships from distant seas would pierce the quiet, and the warriors of Japan would face a new kind of challenge, one they could not strike, only endure. By the mid-1800s, Japan stood at the edge of two worlds. One was ancient, defined by the rhythm of the rice fields, the poetry of the seasons, and the quiet discipline of those who still bowed before the way of the sword. The other was modern, loud, impatient, and carried across the waves by black ships and cannon smoke. The Tokugawa shogunate, which had ruled for over 250 years, began to tremble beneath the weight of its own stillness. The peace it had built had become a kind of sleep, and outside that dream, the world had changed. Steam engines roared across continents. Telegraphs whispered messages faster than any messenger on horseback. And in 1853, when Commodore Perry arrived from America with a fleet of black ships, Japan awoke. Imagine the scene. The samurai, trained for centuries to face an enemy with bow, sword, or musket, now standing on a beach staring at metal monsters that breathed fire and sang thunder. No code, no poem, no sword could cut smoke. Perry's arrival wasn't an invasion. It was an invitation written in gunpowder. The shogunate, realizing how far the world had advanced, had no choice but to open the gates. Trade began. Treaties were signed. And suddenly, the isolation that had preserved the samurai's way also exposed how fragile it had become. For the first time in centuries, the Japanese people began to question the world they had inherited. The samurai, once the highest class of society, found themselves surrounded by new ideas, democracy, capitalism, industry, all spoken in foreign tongues and measured in profit rather than honor. Many resisted. Some argued that Japan could adapt without abandoning its traditions. Others saw resistance as foolish pride, but among them were samurai who understood the truth, that survival required transformation. It's easy to romanticize their downfall, to picture proud warriors walking into the sunset as modernity swallows them. But the reality was quieter, slower, more human. Many samurai simply adjusted. They traded their armor for suits, their swords for pens, and their loyalty to a single lord for loyalty to an emerging nation. Some became teachers, others soldiers in the new imperial army, and a few politicians shaping the new Meiji government that rose after the shogunate's fall in 1868. Still, it wasn't easy. The transition from sword to scroll required humility, and humility rarely comes without resistance. The last great test of the samurai came with the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, a man who, even in life, felt like a ghost from an earlier age. Saigo was a paradox. He helped build the new government that abolished the samurai class, then led a rebellion to defend it. His followers were the last of the true warriors, men who refused to trade their swords for salaries, who still believed that Bushido meant something sacred. The rebellion was brief but fierce. Modern rifles against blades, ideals against inevitability, and when it ended, the world of the samurai ended with it. Saigo died on the battlefield, or perhaps by his own hand. No one knows for certain, but Japan later enshrined him as a hero, because even in defeat, he represented something the nation refused to forget: the dignity of purpose, the calm in chaos, the unyielding devotion to one's principles. With the Meiji Restoration, the government outlawed the wearing of swords, dismantled the feudal domains, and replaced the rigid hierarchy with merit-based civil service. The age of samurai lords and retainers gave way to modern citizens and bureaucrats. Yet, in that dismantling, something unexpected happened. The spirit of the samurai did not vanish. It transformed. Their discipline found new homes, in classrooms, in workshops, in art studios, and in factories. The same attention to detail that once honed a blade now crafted porcelain, architecture, and industry. The calm focus that once guided a duel now guided engineers and artists. Even the old codes of Bushido lingered, not as law, but as a whisper in the national soul, teaching that integrity, endurance, and mastery mattered more than conquest. In a sense, every modern Japanese worker, artist, and scholar inherited fragments of the samurai's discipline. The bow before entering a room, the precise placement of hands when offering a gift, the quiet apology given with a lowered head, all small echoes of a time when the body spoke the language of respect more fluently than words. But the nostalgia for the samurai never faded entirely. It seeped into literature, theater, and later, film. The kabuki stage retold their tragedies. Their loyalty and downfall became legend. In the 20th century, directors like Akira Kurosawa revived them through cinema, giving the world archetypes that would ripple across cultures, from the lone warrior of Seven Samurai to the gunslingers of the American West. It's almost poetic. The very class that once feared change became the myth that inspired it. Still, the real samurai were never perfect. They were human, capable of cruelty as much as compassion, of greed as much as grace. They upheld ideals that sometimes broke under their own weight. Yet perhaps that is why their story endures. Because it's not about perfection. It's about the lifelong effort to live with intention. Imagine one of them now. In the twilight of the 19th century, a man born into a world of honor and armor, now walking through a Tokyo street lined with lamps and telegraph wires. He hears the hum of the city growing around him. He feels the sword at his side, useless, yet heavy with memory. He stops at a bridge, watching his reflection tremble in the water, and perhaps he smiles, because though the world has changed, the reflection still bows back. Many such men left journals, quiet notes written not in anger, but in acceptance. The way changes, one wrote, but the heart remains the same. And indeed, the samurai heart lived on, in the Bushido spirit that fueled soldiers in later wars, in the artisans who built beauty from precision, in the calligraphers who sought perfection in imperfection. Even today, Japan honors that legacy not through conquest but through craft, through patience, through the quiet pride of mastery. The samurai's greatest victory was not in battle, but in how completely their ideals became invisible, woven into the daily gestures of an entire culture. They remind us that discipline isn't about suppression, it's about alignment, about finding stillness amid movement, courage amid restraint. Perhaps that's why their story still comforts us at night. Because in a world that races forward, the samurai remind us that sometimes strength is not in speed, but in stillness. You can almost hear it now, the soft rustle of silk armor, the whisper of straw sandals over stone, the steady breath before a strike, the silence after. The world they built is gone, but their rhythm remains, in the sound of the tea pouring, the brush gliding across paper, the wind through bamboo. And so, as we drift further into this quiet night, let the samurai's spirit keep you company. Let their calm endurance remind you that every life has seasons, every blade has balance, and every silence has meaning. The samurai may have laid down their swords, but they never truly disappeared. They simply became part of the pause between heartbeats, the stillness before dawn. The world after the wars of unification was a quieter one, but quiet does not always mean peace. The Tokugawa shogunate had brought order, yes, but order has its own kind of weight. It presses down gently at first, like a silk cloth laid over the soul. But over years, even silk becomes heavy. The samurai found themselves drifting between purpose and habit, warriors with no wars, poets with calloused hands. In every province, castles stood tall but empty. The great gates opened each morning to routines that had once served kings and generals, now reduced to ceremonial echoes. The guards still bowed, The drums still beat at sunrise, but their rhythm was for memory, not for battle. You could walk through the corridors of a fortress and hear the sighs of ghosts disguised as clerks. This was a Japan built on stillness, and in stillness, the samurai began to turn inward. Many who once trained their bodies began training their minds. Some studied the tea ceremony, others devoted themselves to Zen. The same discipline that once swung blades now folded paper cranes. The quiet became their new battlefield. Each morning began the same. The samurai would rise before dawn, sit facing the paper walls as the first light slid through the shoji, and listen, not to birds or voices, but to the sound of the world waking. To them, that sound was sacred. It reminded them that life continued even when swords slept. Their homes reflected their hearts, simple, empty, and deliberate. Tatami floors, ink paintings, small altars lit by candlelight. Even beauty had to be controlled, arranged, understood. There was no chaos allowed, not even in art. A scroll slightly tilted was not a mistake. It was a lesson in impermanence. The samurai who lived through this age learned something new about power. That the greatest form of strength might be the ability to remain still, to do nothing, perfectly. The sword became a symbol not of killing, but of discipline. The blade on the wall was a reminder of potential, silent, waiting, but never reaching. Some took to gardening, sculpting landscapes so controlled they seemed effortless. A rock placed just so. A ripple of sand drawn into perfect circles. A pine trimmed until it spoke the language of wind. Each gesture carried meaning. Each pause, intention. The samurai didn't need war to master themselves. They only needed time. But time, as always, was not patient. It moved softly at first, then all at once. Foreign whispers arrived through the ports, rumors of Western inventions, guns that could fire faster than thought, ships made of steel instead of wood. The older samurai dismissed such tales. Let them have their toys, they said. We have spirit. But spirit, though strong, cannot stop tides. In Edo, the city we now call Tokyo, the samurai could already sense the shift. Merchants grew richer, farmers owned more land, and the once revered warrior class began to look less like protectors and more like relics. Their stipends were reduced, their authority questioned, and though they still carried swords, they found fewer reasons to draw them. It was perhaps the first time in Japanese history that silence itself began to frighten the samurai. The quiet they once mastered became a mirror too sharp to look into. Yet even in decline, their dignity remained. They continued to teach their sons the same rituals: how to bow, how to write, how to die well. The next generation, born into peace, studied their father's calligraphy beside swords they would never need. It was both beautiful and deeply sad. The philosophy of Bushido began to evolve, no longer a rule for battle, but a guide for living. The writings of thinkers like Yamaga Soko turned it into a moral system for the heart. A samurai was to serve not a lord, but a greater idea: integrity, justice, benevolence. Even if no one sees you, one text read, act as though the world is watching. It was a kind of quiet accountability, a reminder that honor was not performance. It was presence. This was the period when Zen became the invisible backbone of their discipline. Meditation halls filled with warriors turned philosophers. They sat motionless for hours, breathing through the stillness until thought itself dissolved. The samurai understood something most people never do: that thought is not always the path to clarity. Sometimes clarity begins where thinking ends. But for every man who found enlightenment in the temple, another drowned in the emptiness of peace. Some turned to drink, others to nostalgia, longing for the rush of a life defined by certainty. Because you see, war had given them identity. Peace demanded they create their own. And that perhaps was the hardest duel of all. In those quiet years, art bloomed like spring after frost. Ink painting became meditation, haiku became confession, and every gesture in daily life, from setting a cup to opening a door, was turned into ritual. The samurai learned to find perfection in imperfection, to see truth in simplicity. The poet Basho, though not a samurai himself, wrote in a way that resonated with them. The temple bell stops, but the sound keeps coming out of the flowers. It was the same lesson they had learned from the blade, that endings are never truly ends, only transformations. Meanwhile, in distant corners of Japan, small schools of martial arts survived, not as preparation for battle, but as preservation of memory. Children practiced with wooden swords, repeating stances passed down for generations. Each strike carried the ghost of 1,000 ancestors, and every bow before the mat was a silent prayer to discipline itself. The teachers never raised their voices. They didn't need to. Their silence was heavier than shouting. A single nod from a master could feel like a thunderclap. Outside these dojos, Japan continued to change. Towns grew into cities, merchants into magnates. And yet, even in the clamor of progress, the samurai remained symbols of quiet perfection. You could still recognize them in a crowd. The way they stood, the way they moved, calm, measured, deliberate. as if each step was part of a ceremony older than memory. The Westerners who began arriving in Japan found them both fascinating and bewildering. They bowed to death as if greeting an old friend, one traveler wrote, and drink tea as though time itself must wait until they finish. It's hard to imagine now, but to the samurai, even death was simply another act of grace. They believed that how one faced the end mattered more than how one lived. That acceptance, that surrender to impermanence, became their truest strength. And yet, there were cracks forming in the calm. The younger generation, born into comfort, began to see the old ways as performance. They mocked the rituals, the endless rules about posture, speech, and humility. What good is honor, they asked, when rice costs more than loyalty? The elders said nothing, because silence to them was still the sharpest response. But the silence hurt. Some samurai sought meaning by leaving their posts, traveling into mountains, living as hermits. There, they wrote poetry about fog, rivers, and the sound of wind moving through bamboo. Their solitude was not loneliness. It was devotion. One such man, Takuan Soho, a Zen monk and teacher to swordsmen, once wrote, "The mind must be like water, flowing without clinging, cutting without breaking." The samurai who read those words found solace in them, because they understood that the greatest mastery was not control, but harmony. So as the world shifted around them, the samurai began to fade gently into it, not fighting their disappearance, but shaping it into beauty. They became painters, monks, historians. They wrote down what they remembered, not to preserve glory, but to preserve wisdom. Their writing spoke not of victory, but of balance. "A sword that has never been drawn," one wrote, "is sharper than one that has tasted blood." It was during this time that the myth of the samurai truly crystallized. When they no longer ruled, they became legend. And legends are harder to destroy than armies. If you wander through Kyoto today and walk beneath the red torii gates, you might still feel them in the way the wind moves through the pines, in the stillness before a bell sounds. The samurai never truly left. They just stopped needing to be seen. In every tea ceremony, every stroke of calligraphy, every bow before an altar, the echo of their discipline lingers. And somewhere, perhaps, beneath a quiet temple or forgotten garden, a rusted blade still lies in its sheath, untouched for centuries, yet still perfect, because perfection in the samurai way was never about use, it was about readiness. So tonight, as we drift with them further into their long twilight, imagine the faint creak of wooden floors beneath sandals, the scent of incense curling into still air, and the glow of a candle that has burned for centuries without ever going out. Because though the men themselves have vanished, their rhythm remains. It hums in every act of grace, in every moment of restraint, in every heart that still believes that calm is not weakness, but power waiting to be understood. By the mid-1800s, the rhythm of Japan began to change in ways no master could control. The merchants had grown powerful, the farmers independent, and the common people restless. The once clear lines between the classes blurred like ink in the rain. The samurai still walked proudly through the streets, swords at their sides, but the people now whispered behind them, not with fear, but curiosity. In the old days, a samurai's glance could silence a crowd. Now, the crowd merely stepped aside with polite smiles, bowing perhaps out of habit, not reverence. It was a small shift, but small shifts are how worlds end. Still, the samurai tried to hold their dignity. They continued their rituals, their morning meditations, their lessons in calligraphy and swordsmanship. They bowed to portraits of ancestors who had fought under banners long since folded away. They practiced duels with bamboo swords, knowing well that no real enemy remained. They were preserving rhythm for rhythm's sake. The world beyond Japan's shores was already in motion. Steamships thundered through the oceans. Factories exhaled smoke into the sky. Cities grew like restless creatures of iron and glass. To the samurai, these things seemed both wondrous and vulgar. Machines could make weapons faster, yes, but could they make a warrior wiser? When the black ships appeared in Edo Bay, the quiet of Japan cracked open like a bell struck in the night. The foreign emissaries came with top hats, treaties, and cannons, and the samurai, for the first time, faced an enemy they could neither charge nor reason with. Diplomacy was the new battlefield, and on this field, swords were useless. Imagine them standing on the shore, their armor glinting faintly beneath the gray light, watching ships that moved without sails, hearing languages that bent like unfamiliar steel. They did not fear these men exactly, but they feared what they represented, a world that had learned to fight without honor. The shogunate tried to balance the impossible, to preserve isolation while entertaining the idea of modernity. But balance is a blade's edge, and Japan's blade was beginning to tremble. Some samurai argued for resistance, others for reform. If we do not change, one warned, we will be changed. Yet change came regardless, as change always does. In the bustling streets of Edo, foreign traders now walked freely. Students learned English, French, and mathematics. Samurai children who once memorized poetry about cherry blossoms now read textbooks about steam pressure. It was not betrayal. It was adaptation. but to the older warriors it felt like losing the language of the soul. The Meiji Restoration that followed was less a single moment than a long exhale. The emperor, once a distant symbol, became a living ruler again, and the samurai, whose loyalty had shaped empires, were told that loyalty would now mean something else entirely. Loyalty to the nation, not to the lord. The ancient clans were dissolved, the swords outlawed in public. The government offered stipends to compensate the samurai for their loss of privilege. But money cannot replace meaning. Many accepted it quietly, bowing as they folded away their armor for the last time. Others rebelled, unable to accept a world where the weight of a sword no longer defined a man's worth. The Satsuma Rebellion, led by Saigo Takamori, burned like the final flare of a dying star. A handful of old warriors took up arms against a new government that they themselves had helped to build. They knew they could not win, but that was not the point. To them, it was an act of remembrance, a final salute to a way of being that refused to go quietly. When the smoke cleared and Saigo fell, Japan bowed to him in mourning, not victory, because even the victors understood he had died protecting not power, but purpose. After that, the samurai as a class ceased to exist, but the samurai as an idea only grew stronger. Their silence echoed into every corner of Japan's rebirth. The discipline of the dojo became the discipline of the factory floor. The focus once given to perfecting sword technique became the same focus used to craft porcelain, weave silk, or engineer machines. The same reverence for mastery survived. It simply changed shape. Even the schools began to teach Bushido again, not as feudal loyalty, but as moral education. Children recited lessons on honesty, courage, and respect, not realizing that they were memorizing the ghost of the old warrior code. The samurai's influence lived on in art as well, in the long brush strokes of calligraphy, in the minimalism of architecture, in the silence between notes in a shakuhachi flute melody. They had taught Japan not just how to fight, but how to pause, how to let meaning exist in the spaces between words. There were still a few true samurai alive. Gray-haired men walking through streets now filled with electric lamps. They wore Western coats over their kimonos, a sword still hanging at their side, though no one dared ask why. They bowed to strangers who no longer knew how to return the gesture. Yet inside, they carried centuries. Some of them wrote memoirs, quiet reflections rather than manifestos. The sword is no longer needed, one old man wrote, but may the hand that once held it never forget how to be steady. Another wrote, we spent lifetimes learning how to die, but perhaps now Japan must learn how to live. And live it did. The Meiji era turned Japan into a storm of invention and ambition. Railways carved through valleys, schools multiplied, factories glowed through the night. The nation learned how to move fast, but in some corners, the old slowness remained. You could still find a tea house tucked behind a street of modern shops, a small wooden gate half hidden by vines. Inside, a single candle flickered beside a kettle, and there, an elderly man poured tea with the same precision his grandfather once used to draw a blade. The sound of the pouring water was still the same, steady, deliberate, like a heartbeat from another age. The spirit of the samurai had simply gone undercover. It hid in the gestures of respect, in the way craftsmen bowed before their tools, in the quiet patience of calligraphers grinding inkstones each morning, in the unseen pride of a gardener pruning a bonsai for decades. That is the strange immortality of discipline. You cannot destroy it. You can only disguise it. Even as Japan faced wars and modern conflicts in the century ahead, echoes of the old code lingered, not always for good, but never without meaning. The samurai spirit became both a mirror and a question. What does honor mean in a world that forgets how to be still? Perhaps that question is why their story endures. Because the samurai were not perfect men. They were seekers. Men who spent lifetimes trying to bridge the gap between violence and virtue, action and calm. The modern world tells us that peace is the absence of conflict. But the samurai might say peace is the mastery of it, the stillness that comes when nothing left inside you needs to strike. So tonight, as we drift among their memories, imagine the last of them walking home through rain-darkened streets, his sandals tapping softly on the stones, a paper lantern swinging in his hand, casting warm light on walls where ivy grows. He passes a blacksmith's shop, hears the faint echo of hammer on steel, stops for a moment, smiles, because even now, someone still shapes the soul of metal with patience, with breath, with rhythm. The samurai bows slightly to the sound, then moves on, disappearing into the mist. And perhaps, in that image, we see what they became. Not ghosts, not relics, but reminders that there is beauty in patience, strength in grace, and power in restraint. For though their swords have rusted, their silence remains unbroken, eternal, like the breath between two waves, the pause between two centuries. The Meiji era stretched on, like a long exhale between centuries. It was an age of restless transformation. Steam engines replaced horses. Telegrams replaced messengers. and the world that once moved to the sound of wooden sandals now pulsed with the clatter of iron wheels. The samurai watched quietly as their country awakened from the long dream of feudalism. Some smiled, others sighed. The old castles still stood, though their moats were filled not with water, but with weeds. Tourists came from the cities to marvel at their walls, snapping photographs where arrows once flew. Children tossed stones into the silence and laughed, unaware that beneath their feet slept the bones of men who had lived and died by silence itself. Inside those same castles, you could sometimes find an old retainer sweeping the courtyard, still bowing before empty halls each morning. He would light incense before a portrait of his long-dead lord, not out of superstition, but out of rhythm. For a samurai, duty did not end when the command did. It lingered. The way a note lingers after the flute is set down. In the villages, descendants of warriors now tilled soil, sold fabric, or worked in the new railways. Their hands, once trained for the sword, now measured thread or tightened bolts. Yet the precision remained. They bowed to customers with the same poise they once offered generals, because in their hearts, service had always been the true weapon. Japan itself began to glow with a strange kind of energy. The streets filled with lamps that burned brighter than any moon. The hum of factories became the country's new heartbeat. The nation was learning speed, and the samurai spirit, built on slowness, control, and reflection, began to feel like a shadow out of time. And yet, when the new soldiers of the imperial army marched in formation, their discipline looked eerily familiar. Straight backs, perfect silence, unflinching focus. The drill sergeants, though dressed in Western uniforms, spoke with the same tone the masters of the old dojos had used. The sword was gone, but the posture remained. It is difficult to erase a philosophy that has lived for 1,000 years. It seeps into posture, into tone, into how one pours tea. The samurai had not died. They had been absorbed, folded into the fabric of modern Japan, like a second thread woven invisibly beneath the new one. Writers of the time began to notice, and they worried. Some feared that industrialization would steal Japan's soul, that the quiet grace of the samurai would vanish under the noise of progress. One philosopher wrote, "We are building railways into the future, but perhaps we are leaving our reflection behind." Artists answered with stillness. They painted mist over mountains, cherry blossoms against endless skies. Calligraphy strokes so thin and balanced that each one looked like a held breath. In every brushstroke, you could feel the same patience the samurai once carried on their swords. There were still small dojos scattered through the countryside, wooden halls where boys and girls practiced kendo, the way of the sword. But now, the bamboo blades struck not to kill, but to listen. Each clash of wood was a heartbeat, each bow a small resurrection of respect. The masters of these schools were often grandsons of warriors. They no longer spoke of battle, but of balance. A sword, they told their students, is not for cutting others. It is for cutting ignorance. The children would laugh, thinking it was a riddle, and perhaps it was. But then they'd strike again. And the sound of bamboo meeting bamboo would echo through the rafters like memory itself. The government, too, began to see the value in remembering. Schools taught discipline and humility as civic virtues. Even new sports like judo and kendo were not just games but continuations of the old path. They taught control, focus, and above all, respect for form. To outsiders, Japan looked like a paradox. A country that wore Western suits but bowed before entering a room. That built battleships but arranged flowers with trembling reverence. It was modern, yes, but the samurai heartbeat was still there, beneath the silk and the steel. The old masters of the brush and sword wrote quietly about this shift. They did not resist it. They simply observed, as they always had. One aged calligrapher wrote in his journal, "When the cherry tree grows too tall, it bends toward the light. We must bend too, or break." And so the samurai bent. Some traveled abroad, studying science, art, and engineering in Europe. They returned home wearing suits but still carried the stillness of their ancestors. A few even brought back foreign philosophies, combining them with Bushido to create new forms of ethics. The fusion of East and West was awkward at first, like two swords learning to share the same scabbard, but slowly it found its balance. Meanwhile, in the growing cities, poets began to write about memory, about the feeling of losing something sacred without knowing when it left. They described the streets as temples of noise, where everyone moved quickly, but no one bowed anymore. One poem from the late Meiji era reads, "The train whistles, and the mountain bows. We follow neither. We stand between." It captures the very soul of the time. Japan standing between what it had been and what it was becoming. The last living samurai saw it all. Old men sitting on porches, watching telegraph poles rise like strange new trees. Hearing the hum of electric lines where wind once sang. They didn't complain. They simply adjusted their robes and waited. One such man, Kawakami, was known to walk the same path to the temple every morning, bow to the statue of Kannon, the goddess of mercy, then bow again to a small patch of grass where, long ago, his lord had once stood. He never spoke of the past. He didn't have to. His silence was enough. His neighbors called him the living ghost of the old Japan. But he was not a ghost. He was a reminder that reverence is not nostalgia. It is gratitude that refuses to vanish. If you traveled through rural Japan during this time, you might still find homes where swords hung above doorways, their edges dulled with time, their handles wrapped with new silk each year during festivals. The children were told, "This belonged to your ancestor, a man of the sword. Remember him, not for what he did, but for how he stood." And so they remembered, not through war, but through posture, through manners, through calm. The samurai spirit had become invisible, but not weaker. It existed now in the unseen details, in the grace with which one folded clothes, the care taken in wrapping a gift, the patience with which one listened before speaking. It had become the soul of politeness itself. Even the tea masters of the new century whispered to their students, "A bow is sharper than a blade." In this new Japan, Bushido became less about dying for honor and more about living with integrity. It was taught in schools, recited by workers, and quietly believed by millions who had never seen a sword. Some Westerners mocked it, calling it obsession. Others admired it, calling it art. But for the Japanese, it was neither. It was simply how one moved through the world. And when war did return, in a later century, many remembered Bushido not as philosophy, but as duty. The old code found itself twisted by ambition, but even then, in the ashes that followed, Japan rebuilt not through conquest, but through the same spirit of mastery and humility that had always guided it. Factories rose again. Hands shaped steel and silk with reverence. Artists painted cranes over broken walls. And the quiet precision of the samurai returned once more. This time through craft, patience, and purpose. Because the truth is, no idea ever truly dies. It simply changes form. The samurai began as warriors, then became poets, then teachers, and finally, examples. Their memory woven into how an entire culture breathes. Even now, when a craftsman polishes a blade for months until it gleams like water, or when a calligrapher spends an hour balancing a single stroke, or when a child bows before answering a question, the same thread continues, invisible, unbroken. It's tempting to think the samurai belonged to another world entirely, but in truth, they were always searching for what we search for now: peace, purpose, and the strength to live gracefully in a world that keeps changing. Perhaps that's why their story comforts us still, because it reminds us that strength does not need to shout, and silence does not mean surrender. The old dojos have faded. The castles are museums, the armor polished behind glass. But step outside those walls at dusk and look at the horizon, where the mountains meet the mist, and you might imagine a figure standing there, still, waiting. He does not fight anymore. He does not speak. But in his stillness, he is teaching the same lesson he always did, that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of control. And as the lanterns flicker across Tokyo's rivers, as trains hum beneath the stars, the old spirit drifts quietly between buildings, unseen but unmistakable, reminding each generation to pause, breathe, and bow before whatever they love. By the dawn of the 20th century, Japan had learned to breathe in rhythm with the modern world, and yet, beneath the clatter of trains and the buzz of electricity, the old pulse of Bushido remained. It no longer commanded the body, it commanded the spirit. The samurai way, once spoken in iron and blood, now whispered through manners, art, and the quiet posture of the nation itself. Factories rose where rice fields once stretched. Men worked under lamps instead of sunlight. Women stitched kimonos beside machines that hummed with foreign rhythm. But even in this motion, there was grace. Workers still bowed before beginning their day, still polished their tools, still moved with care, as though someone unseen was watching. That unseen watcher, of course, was the ghost of the samurai, not in the haunting sense, but in the guiding sense. The old discipline had become a kind of muscle memory of the culture, shaping every gesture, every silence, every pause before a word. Writers began to notice it. They said the samurai had not vanished. They had simply become the air of Japan. You could not see them, but you could feel them in the balance of a room, the calm tone of a craftsman, the hush before applause. It is strange, isn't it? How something once built for war could become the foundation of peace. How the art of killing could evolve into the art of living. But that was always the hidden paradox of the samurai. They did not fight to destroy. They fought to understand. And when the fighting ended, that understanding remained. In the new schools of art and literature, the samurai spirit reappeared in unexpected ways. Architects designed buildings with simplicity and symmetry. Painters balanced negative space as if wielding invisible swords. Even the emerging art of cinema borrowed their sense of timing, silence, and inevitability. The world saw it too. When foreign travelers came to Japan in the early 1900s, they wrote of a country unlike any other, one that moved at two speeds at once, fast in its inventions, but slow in its soul. Every gesture is a ceremony, one visitor wrote. Even the pouring of tea feels like an act of prayer. That prayer, of course, was the echo of Bushido. In the countryside, the last of the old dojos still echoed with wooden strikes. Bamboo swords met in rhythm like raindrops on a roof. Children shouted not in anger, but in precision. Their masters corrected them softly, reminding them that each breath must end where the movement ends. No one called them samurai anymore, but in truth, they were. The word had changed its clothing, but not its meaning. Even as Japan's ambitions grew beyond its shores, the code remained, twisted at times, misused by those who remembered only the obedience and forgot the compassion. Yet even through the noise of war, the quieter truths of Bushido survived. In those who still believed that strength without humility was emptiness. After the storms of conflict passed, Japan found itself broken, but not hollow. And in rebuilding, the nation returned once again to its oldest strength: mastery through patience, purpose through repetition. Factories reopened with the same precision once used in forging swords. Engineers treated their machines like students of an ancient art. Every detail mattered. Every process had rhythm. It was not about speed. It was about perfection. The samurai had taught Japan that true pride lies not in winning, but in refining. The tea masters continued this lesson, even in the midst of rubble, pouring water slowly, arranging cups with trembling hands, showing that even in ruin, grace could endure. One writer from the 1950s described walking into a Tokyo shop where an old man repaired watches. He moved, he said, like a samurai who had traded his blade for time itself. That was the new Japan, a nation that forged patience into progress, discipline into design, Bushido into beauty. Even in the arts that traveled abroad, like judo, kendo, and aikido, you could feel the same philosophy pulsing beneath the surface. They were never really about combat, but about the conquest of the self, the bow before a match, the calm after defeat, the stillness between motions. All of it whispered of a time when every step and every breath meant something sacred. The Western world, fascinated by this quiet strength, began to borrow from it. Soldiers studied the strategies of Musashi. CEOs quoted his writings as if they were ancient business plans. Artists painted samurai standing against storms, not as killers, but as emblems of focus, endurance, and control. It was ironic, really. The West had once forced Japan open. Now it found itself peering into Japan's stillness for answers. And perhaps that is the true measure of endurance. when your silence becomes the thing others come to hear. The samurai spirit became philosophy, art, and aspiration. It reached into the smallest corners of life, into the way people cleaned their homes, or wrote letters, or bowed before a meal. The reverence for detail turned even the ordinary into ceremony. If you stood in a Kyoto tea house in those years, you might see a young woman arranging flowers beside a rusted sword displayed on the wall. The blade no longer shone, yet its presence filled the room with gravity. The petals trembled slightly in the draft, as though remembering that beauty once shared space with danger. Outside, the streets grew brighter each year. Electric signs flickered where torches once glowed. And yet, in the quiet corners, the soul of the old world waited. Every so often, a child would ask his grandfather why he still bowed to the old shrine, why he kept polishing a blade no one would ever use. And the grandfather would smile and say softly, "Because when you polish what you no longer need, you remember who you are." The samurai had always known this, that maintenance is devotion, and devotion is its own form of peace. Even the simplest gestures carried weight. A carpenter setting down his hammer, a chef sharpening his knife before dawn, a writer placing his brush neatly beside the inkstone before closing the scroll. Every act, no matter how small, became a kind of worship, a quiet honoring of the moment before it fades. It is easy to imagine that the samurai lived only in the past, but their essence is timeless. It exists wherever people strive to move through life with integrity, wherever they choose focus over distraction and calm over chaos. If you walk through Tokyo today, you might pass an office where a worker sits perfectly still before beginning his day, or a craftsman tying his apron in careful symmetry, or a child bowing before starting practice. And though none of them would call themselves samurai, the rhythm of their actions would tell you otherwise. The samurai have become not warriors of the sword, but warriors of attention, protectors of presence. In our own restless age, their quiet lessons feel almost radical. To pause before you speak, to finish what you start, to treat your tools with respect, to leave behind something slightly better than you found it. These were the samurai's teachings, and they are no less relevant now than when they were written in blood and wind. The sword may no longer be forged, but the spirit that shaped it still burns. It burns in the hand that reaches for precision. A nation once divided by war found unity not through conquest, but through craft, through ritual, through grace. And when the old temples ring their bells at dusk, The sound still carries through the valleys. You can almost hear the echo of 1,000 unseen warriors bowing once more to the horizon, not in mourning, but in gratitude, because what they built was not an empire, but a rhythm. And as the evening falls softly over Kyoto, over Nara, over Tokyo's endless lights, that rhythm continues, pulsing beneath the surface of every life that moves with purpose. The samurai are gone, but they are everywhere, in the quiet of the workshop, in the whisper of a bamboo grove, in the careful brushstroke of a painter who refuses haste. Every act of patience, every moment of restraint, every bow is a small resurrection of their way. The world will always change, faster than any of us can hold it. But somewhere between what fades and what remains, there will always be a calm figure standing still, not fighting, not retreating, just breathing. And if you ever feel lost, if the noise grows too loud, remember them. The men who built peace out of precision and silence out of strength, because the samurai never truly ended. They simply became the pause between generations, the stillness between thoughts, the quiet between storms. Every culture needs its ghosts, and the samurai were no exception. When night fell over a feudal village, even the bravest warrior felt the thin fabric of the world stretch, letting whispers slip through. They called them yurei, the restless spirits of those who died with unfinished duty. White-robed, pale-faced, their hair falling like ink over moonlight. A samurai could face death in battle without blinking, but the idea of a spirit wronged, of an oath unfulfilled, that could make even a seasoned fighter tighten his grip on the hilt. They believed that the soul of a warrior who failed in loyalty might wander forever, trapped between worlds, doomed to repeat the final moment of dishonor again and again. That was why the code of Bushido was more than rule. It was insurance for the afterlife. In small tea houses and roadside inns, storytellers would weave these ghost tales into long winter nights. Guests leaned close. The fire cracked. Sake warmed their breath, and the story would begin softly. A samurai returned from war, but his promise was broken, his master dead, and his name dishonored. Now he walks only by moonlight, seeking the bow he once refused to draw. The listeners would shiver, not from cold, but from memory, because each man in the room knew that loyalty was not just duty, it was salvation. It's strange to think that in a world of battle and blood, fear came not from dying, but from dying wrong. But the samurai were not always so grim. Between their rituals and wars, they had humor, dry, subtle, often self-deprecating. They wrote short poems, senryu, that mocked themselves and the absurdities of their own discipline. A samurai once wrote, "Even my sword, bored with peace, yawns at my reflection." Another wrote, "I trimmed the hedge, too straight, even the ants march like soldiers." That was the other side of Bushido, the ability to laugh at perfection, to acknowledge how rigid they had become. Humor was not weakness. It was balance, a quiet valve for a culture obsessed with control. In some castles, jesters and storytellers were prized nearly as highly as guards. Their duty was not entertainment, it was perspective. They reminded the powerful that laughter was a weapon too, against pride, against fear, against the creeping loneliness of command. A general who could laugh at himself, they said, was impossible to defeat. Beyond the battlefields, another art grew in the samurai world, the art of stillness and movement. In the rain-soaked gardens of Kyoto and Kamakura, monks taught warriors the practice of Zen. It was not a religion of words, it was one of breath, silence, and sudden clarity. Samurai would sit for hours facing a wall, unmoving, waiting for a thought to dissolve. At first it seemed absurd. How could a man who fought for a living sit so still? But soon they realized. Meditation was simply another duel between mind and distraction. The swing of a sword, the brushstroke of a painter, the placement of a stone in a garden, all came from the same center. That center was called Mushin, the empty mind, a state where you did not think, you simply acted. In that emptiness, perfection was possible, not because you tried harder, but because you finally stopped trying at all. The samurai learned that the true battle was not against enemies, but against hesitation. Zen gave them what war never could, peace that required no victory. One of the most remarkable figures to embody this balance was Takuan Soho, a monk, philosopher, and teacher to swordsmen. He once wrote, "The mind must be like the moon reflected on the water. The sword moves, but the reflection is still." He taught that the moment you let your thoughts settle on life or death, you lose. A samurai must move as naturally as falling rain, with neither fear nor pride. These teachings spread far beyond temples. They seeped into the rhythm of Japan itself, the pauses in its poetry, the spaces in its music, the simplicity of its art. Even centuries later, the faint hum of Zen echoes through every Japanese brushstroke, every garden stone, every bow before a doorway. And yet Zen was not the only lens through which the samurai saw their world. They had another older companion, Shinto, the belief that all things possess a spirit. Trees, rivers, rocks, even swords. When a blade was forged, a ritual was performed to invite its kami, or soul. Blacksmiths worked in near silence, treating the forge like a shrine, every spark a small prayer. To own a sword was not to own an object, it was to carry a being of intention, a reflection of the self. That is why a samurai never drew his blade without purpose. To unsheath it carelessly was to awaken something sacred for no reason. When one finally broke, it was not discarded. It was buried like a companion with a small ceremony. Even tools of destruction could be revered if used with mindfulness. Sometimes, I think that is what makes their world so haunting. The balance between reverence and ruin. They built their lives around the things that could end them, but treated those very things as holy. A sword, a duty, even death. None of them were feared. They were simply elements of a larger harmony. Perhaps that's why the samurai still capture us. Centuries later, they turned violence into ceremony and mortality into art. In the heart of Kyoto, one can still find the Rinzai temples where samurai once trained their minds as rigorously as their hands. The monks there still walk in silence at dawn, their sandals tapping faintly against ancient stones. Each morning begins with zazen, seated meditation, the same rhythm of breath that calmed warriors before battle. Visitors say you can almost feel it, that strange mix of focus and surrender. Even now, the air carries something, not memory exactly, but presence, as though time itself bows quietly before entering. And outside those temples, the samurai gardens still whisper, sand raked in flowing lines, stones placed with impossible precision, moss arranged as though painted by patience itself. Every element is deliberate, yet looks effortless. That was the hidden genius of their culture, effort concealed within grace. The same principle that guided a swordsman's cut guided the gardener's rake. Both sought the same thing, the moment when motion becomes meditation. Among their most beloved sayings was, "A warrior is not one who fights, but one who masters himself." It's easy to imagine that written in calligraphy, hung above a doorway, or whispered before sleep. To them, mastery did not mean dominance. It meant alignment. To draw the sword at the right moment, to bow at the right angle, to speak when silence was no longer enough. Their world was an orchestra of precision. And yet, what made it human was the imperfection they allowed to remain. The small crack in a tea bowl, the uneven line in a wall, the trembling hand of an old calligrapher. They called that beauty wabi-sabi, the perfection of imperfection. A samurai could admire the chipped edge of his own blade, not as flaw, but as truth. It might sound strange to think of these men of discipline as poets, but that is what they were. Their lives were haiku written in steel, a few short lines, perfect in rhythm, brief in duration, unforgettable in meaning. They knew the poem always ends, but its echo never does. And so even after the wars ended, their poems lingered, their gardens breathed, their swords rested in shrines, and their silence grew louder with time. You can almost feel it, can't you? That strange comfort in their world, the sense that everything was connected, that even chaos could be shaped by ritual. If you listen closely enough, if you slow down, you can still find that rhythm in your own breath. That is the strange gift of the samurai. They teach us to turn fear into focus and restlessness into grace. Their world, for all its harshness, was never about power. It was about peace. A peace earned through control, through awareness, through the constant shaping of the self. And perhaps, in that way, we are all still learning from them, because even now, centuries later, we crave what they practiced every day. The calm in the center of motion, the beauty in restraint, the silence between the strikes. That is the art they left us. Not war, but awareness. Not conquest, but clarity. And that art, my friend, still waits quietly inside you too. In the stories written about them, the samurai are often painted in black and white, honor or disgrace, victory or death. But life, even then, was never that simple. It unfolded in shades of gray, in the hesitation before a bow, in the tremor of a hand that didn't want to draw the blade. Behind every battle, behind every oath, there were faces waiting at the door, wives lighting lamps that would burn until dawn, mothers tracing prayers on scraps of silk. A samurai was taught from birth that love must never interfere with duty, but in truth, it always did, because to live by the sword meant to die by it. And those who loved a warrior knew that their affection had an expiration date. There are old letters still kept in wooden boxes, written by men who went to war knowing they would never return. The ink has faded, but the voices remain. One reads, "If I fall tomorrow, let our child know. I walk toward death as toward home, because you were there." It is said that some samurai wrote these final letters even before they left, sealing them in small envelopes tied with thread, leaving them hidden beneath floorboards, just in case. They called them Jisei no Ku, death poems. Short, simple, usually written in the last moments before battle. One such poem reads, "A falling blossom returns to the branch? No, it cannot, but still, it dreams." That line carries the entire paradox of their existence. They dreamed of return, but built their lives around the inevitability of loss. To the samurai, death was not tragedy. It was timing. If one's life ended in the right way, with purpose, it was considered perfect. And yet, you can feel it, can't you? Between the lines, that tiny ache, that soft rebellion against inevitability. They learned to accept death, but they never stopped hoping for another dawn. The families they left behind lived by their own code, quieter, but no less demanding. Wives of samurai were expected to embody the same virtues as their husbands: dignity, endurance, loyalty, and silence. They managed estates, educated children, and in some cases, even defended their homes. In the chronicles of feudal Japan, there are tales of women who stood at the gates with spears in hand, their hair tied back with the same composure as their husbands wore helmets. They were not called samurai, but they lived the spirit of one. There was Tomoe Gozen, perhaps the most famous of them all, a warrior in her own right, known for her grace and strength. It was said that she could ride any horse, wield any weapon, and face any man. When her lord fell in battle, she did not retreat. She charged forward, cutting down the enemy commander before vanishing into legend. Her story is more than history. It is a kind of whisper across centuries, reminding us that honor had many faces. Even now, her name appears in poetry, paintings, and plays, as if she were not a woman, but a symbol of courage wrapped in calm. But not all samurai women fought with weapons. Some wielded influence with subtler tools, words, art, or silence. The wife of a daimyo might never raise her voice, but her glance could decide the fate of alliances. In a culture where restraint was virtue, power often hid in quiet corners. There's an old saying, the one who speaks least rules longest. It applied as much in politics as it did in love. For the samurai, emotion was something to be shaped, not shown. They believed that control was strength, and yet they wrote poetry about heartbreak and painted landscapes that ached with loneliness. It's ironic. The same man who could cut through armor would spend hours painting the soft curve of a willow branch or writing about the sound of falling snow. That was their balance, ferocity and tenderness, coexisting like two sides of the same blade. Even their relationships carried this strange mixture of discipline and devotion. A samurai's love was rarely loud. There were no dramatic confessions, no songs beneath balconies. Instead, Affection appeared in gestures, subtle, careful, eternal. A silk cord tied around a letter, a single camellia left by a doorway, a poem hidden in a sleeve. The word AI, meaning love, rarely appeared in their writings. Instead, they spoke of kokoro, heart, not as emotion, but as essence. To love someone was to see their heart as clearly as one saw one's own reflection on the surface of water, and if that reflection trembled, they would wait until it stilled again. That kind of patience is almost unimaginable now. They didn't rush their words. They let them breathe. They understood that love, like skill, needed silence to grow. For many samurai, friendship was even more sacred than romance. There are countless tales of brothers in arms who shared bonds deeper than family. They trained together, ate together, and in many cases, died together. In the old scrolls, there's a phrase, "We are two arrows, drawn from the same string." It meant that once released, their paths could never be separated. These relationships, though never spoken of openly, were the heart of the warrior world. When one fell, the other often followed, through ritual death, not out of despair, but out of promise. It's easy to label that as fanaticism, but it was more than that. To them, loyalty was the purest form of love, and in a society where words were few, action became language. When one samurai drew his sword beside another, it said everything. The idea of loyalty shaped not just relationships, but identity. A samurai without a master was called ronin, a man adrift. They were often pitied, sometimes feared, always misunderstood. Without a lord, they lived in the shadows, swords unsheathed, names unspoken. But among them were men of deep principle, who had lost everything except their sense of honor. The most famous of them all were the 47 Ronin. Their master had been ordered to commit seppuku after striking a corrupt official. The Ronin vowed revenge, waiting years, living as merchants, monks, laborers. Then one winter night, they struck, killing the man responsible. Afterward, they turned themselves in, and one by one, took their own lives to the government. They were criminals. To the people, they were heroes. To the samurai world, they were perfection. Because they proved that loyalty, even after death, could still be fulfilled. The tombs of the 47 still stand in Tokyo, surrounded by incense and silence. People still visit, bowing before the graves, leaving flowers and coins, not out of pity, but respect. They represent the final line of Bushido, the place where law and honor diverged, and the heart chose the latter. The story has been retold countless times, in plays, in films, in whispers. Each retelling changes the details, but never the emotion. It reminds the listener that devotion, in its truest form, defies consequence. And perhaps that is what the samurai understood best, that to love something greater than yourself is to live with a kind of beautiful risk. In the quieter corners of their history, there were rituals of memory. When a warrior died, his armor was polished one last time, his blade placed beside him, a candle was lit, incense burned, and his comrades bowed deeply. Sometimes his horse was set free. Sometimes his helmet was displayed for a year before being buried. The idea was simple: to let the world remember that he had existed, and then to let him go. There was no weeping, no shouting, only the steady rhythm of prayer and the belief that somewhere his spirit was already finding its way back to the wind. The world of the samurai, for all its iron and silence, was filled with tenderness. It hid beneath the folds of robes, behind the formal gestures, between the brush strokes of ink. They understood what few people do now, that strength and sensitivity are not opposites. They are mirrors. To feel deeply and yet act calmly was the highest form of power. A samurai who could cry in secret and still ride to battle at dawn was not weak. He was complete. And when the wars finally ended and Japan began to change, those quiet virtues did not vanish. They became part of the national character. The bow, the patience, the devotion to craft, the soft-spoken humility. These were not remnants of the past. They were the living threads of it. Every gesture, even today, carries an echo of that world. A shopkeeper who bows before handing change. A craftsman who spends years perfecting a single pattern. All of it descends from that same discipline. The same belief that true worth lies not in outcome, but in intent. So when we think of the samurai, it's easy to see only the armor, the swords, the stoic faces. But beneath it all, there were hearts that beat for beauty, for loyalty, for love. They knew that life, like combat, was fleeting, that every moment was a chance to stand correctly, to speak with care, to leave behind something pure. That is why their world still captivates us, because even now, in the middle of our noise and speed, we crave that kind of stillness, that kind of meaning. And if you close your eyes and listen, you can almost hear it. The faint rustle of robes, the echo of a blade returning to its sheath, the sound of someone bowing, not to power, but to peace. Change rarely announces itself politely. It begins in whispers, trade routes opening, ships appearing on the horizon, new goods, new ideas, and with them, new questions. The samurai, once the unshakable pillars of power, began to feel the ground shift beneath their feet. In the middle of the 19th century, foreign ships appeared off the coast of Edo. Their black smoke stained the sky. Their cannons gleamed like strange gods, and the sea itself trembled at their arrival. The people of Japan called them kurofune, the black ships. For centuries, Japan had kept its doors closed, content in its solitude, confident in its order. But the world had changed while it slept, and now it demanded entry. The samurai watched these ships from the cliffs, their hands resting on sword hilts that suddenly felt symbolic rather than practical. The visitors carried not spears or banners, but trade offers, treaties, and iron guns that roared louder than thunder. The shogun's court was thrown into confusion. Some urged resistance, others spoke of negotiation. A few whispered that perhaps the age of the sword had finally met its match. For the first time in memory, the samurai stood not as masters, but as questioners. The arrival of the West cracked Japan open, like a long-sealed temple door, and light flooded in. Too fast, too bright. Western clothes, weapons, factories, schools, railroads. Everything came at once. It was the Meiji Restoration, and it promised rebirth. But for many, it felt like erasure. The samurai, once the guardians of tradition, suddenly became relics of it. Their privileges were stripped away, their lands taxed, their swords banned. It was like asking a poet to forget his words, or a monk to forget his prayers. For generations, their blades had been their identity, their soul, and now the government declared them obsolete. In the cities, some adapted, trading their armor for suits, their swords for pens, joining the ranks of the new bureaucrats. Others could not. They wandered the countryside, still wearing their faded crests, their katanas tied at their sides, though they were no longer legal. They became symbols of something half remembered, half mourned. The old villagers still bowed to them, out of habit more than reverence. But the children, the ones growing up surrounded by telegraph poles and printed books, saw only curiosity, not nobility. It was not an easy ending. Some samurai resisted, rising in rebellion, unable to accept a world where honor was measured by profit. The most famous of them was Saigo Takamori, a man of immense dignity and impossible conviction. He had once helped build the Meiji government, believing it could preserve Japan's spirit while embracing progress. But when it turned its back on the old order, when it outlawed the sword, he could not bear it. He gathered the last of his loyal men and marched against the government he had helped create. It was a hopeless war. Rifles and artillery against blades and courage. The Satsuma Rebellion lasted only months, but in that short time, it became legend. Saigo fought not for victory, but for memory. At the final battle, wounded and surrounded, he ordered his followers to retreat. Then, in the manner of his ancestors, he knelt and chose his own ending. His death marked more than the fall of a man. It marked the closing of a chapter that had lasted 700 years. In the decades that followed, Japan moved forward quickly, perhaps too quickly. Factories replaced fields, rifles replaced swords, and the spirit of Bushido was folded into nationalism, reinterpreted, simplified, sometimes even distorted. Discipline became obedience. The old poets and monks would have frowned. Bushido, once a path of inner balance, became a tool of outer control. Yet, even in that distortion, something of the original remained. The idea that life had meaning only when lived with purpose, that one's work, no matter how small, should be done with full devotion. Those truths were too deeply woven into the Japanese soul to be erased. In the countryside, far from the politics of Tokyo, the remnants of the samurai world lingered quietly. Villages still held small festivals in honor of old clans. Shrines still kept the swords of ancestors, wrapped in cloth, placed beside offerings of sake and rice. Children still heard bedtime stories about loyalty, courage, and the quiet dignity of those who serve. The names of long-dead warriors became lessons, metaphors, lullabies. Be like Musashi, their parents said, not because he fought, but because he learned. And so, slowly, the image of the samurai shifted again. No longer soldiers, but symbols, not of war, but of harmony. Writers of the early 20th century began to rediscover them. Some romanticized, others mourned, but all agreed that something profound had been lost. Yukio Mishima, one of Japan's most controversial authors, wrote that the samurai represented a beauty of death that has no equivalent in life. He saw them as the embodiment of discipline in an undisciplined age. He even tried, in his own tragic way, to bring that spirit back. But history does not allow returns, only echoes. And perhaps that is enough, because the echo still shapes how the world sees Japan, still shapes how Japan sees itself in art, in cinema, in philosophy. The samurai live on. Their faces appear on screens across the world, calm, composed, resolute. Their codes are quoted by athletes, soldiers, entrepreneurs. Know your enemy and know yourself, they say. Fight not for victory, but for mastery. Even people who know little of their history feel drawn to their silence, their restraint, their gravity. It's easy to forget that behind that image were real people, flawed, frightened, proud, tender, men and women who lived by impossible standards and often paid for them dearly. But maybe that is why they endure, because we recognize ourselves in their struggle to be better, to be calm in the storm, to hold on to meaning when the world shifts too quickly. There's a place in Kagoshima where the sea meets the cliffs. Locals say that on quiet evenings, you can still hear the wind move through the grass like the rustle of silk robes. They say the spirits of Saigo's men wander there, not in sorrow, but in satisfaction. They did not save their world, but they honored it. And in the language of Bushido, that is enough. Honor was never about winning. It was about showing up with dignity, with precision, with awareness. Those same virtues are still taught today. In martial arts, dojos across Japan, students bow before entering. They bow before leaving. And for a moment, between those two gestures, they step into an unbroken tradition. They may wear white cotton instead of armor, bamboo swords instead of steel, but the silence is the same. The breath is the same. That is the real victory of the samurai. They turned a way of killing into a way of living. The tourists who visit Kyoto often pause at the shrines, taking photos, buying charms. But if they linger long enough, if they stay past sunset, they might notice something else. The air grows thicker, the cicadas fade, and the whole world seems to bow into stillness. The stones remember the sound of sandals. The rivers remember the taste of blood and rain. And the mountains, those quiet, watchful sentinels, still carry the echo of 1,000 whispered oaths. You can feel it, standing there, that strange calm between pride and peace. That was Bushido, stripped of words. There is a saying, the sword that kills is the same that gives life. It sounds like contradiction, but to the samurai, it was clarity. The sword, they believed, was neither good nor evil. It was the heart that wielded it that decided its nature, and perhaps that is the final truth of their world. They were not gods or myths. They were human beings trying to master their hearts before their weapons. In that struggle, we find the reason their memory endures. As night deepens, I sometimes imagine a single samurai standing on a hill as the world around him changes. Trains rumble in the distance. Telegraph lines hum. He watches quietly, one hand resting on the sword he's forbidden to draw. He knows the future will forget his name, but still, he straightens his back, breathes once, and bows, not to an emperor or a battle, but to the moment itself, because that is all a true warrior can ever master. The now. The samurai world may have vanished, but its lessons remain like stars, invisible in daylight, but always there. Honor, discipline, humility, attention. They were not relics of war, but practices of being. And though the armor is gone, the silence that followed it has become something even stronger. It has become presence in the hum of modern Tokyo. The old and the new coexist like breath and heartbeat. A monk walks past a neon sign. A CEO bows before his staff. A schoolgirl ties her shoes neatly before leaving. Small gestures, vast meanings. Each one a descendant of the samurai way. And as we watch the city lights flicker like countless tiny lanterns, we can almost hear the murmur beneath it all. That same rhythm, that same stillness, that same promise. The samurai are gone, but they left behind not monuments, not conquests. They left behind a manner of being, and it still waits quietly within anyone willing to live deliberately, breathe slowly, and bow before the moment. If you walk through Tokyo at dawn, you will see them, though not in armor, not with swords, but with briefcases and cameras and calloused hands that still move with that same deliberate rhythm. The samurai did not vanish. They evolved. The office worker bowing before entering the building. The chef slicing fish with quiet devotion. The craftsman shaping wood so precisely it seems alive. Each one moves with the same invisible law. That law is called kokoro, the heart, the spirit. It is the unspoken child of Bushido, a code no longer written on scrolls, but etched into the daily gestures of a nation. Even now, when a train leaves the station exactly on time, or a craftsman spends 10 years perfecting a single blade, that is not efficiency. It is ritual. It is the continuation of a discipline older than industry, older than memory. In the aftermath of war, Japan had to rebuild not just its cities, but its soul. The Western world expected it to rise through power, but Japan chose precision. Factories became temples of focus. Each bolt, each stroke of paint, each gear, a small act of prayer. When the first post-war craftsmen began making watches, radios, cars, they approached them not as products, but as reflections. A sword that once defended a lord had become a screwdriver defending an ideal. The same spirit that guided the forging of steel now guided the tightening of a screw. And soon, the world noticed, not because Japan was loud, but because it was perfect. That perfection was not mechanical, it was moral. A quiet insistence that every act deserved attention. Every movement was a chance to restore dignity to a broken world. The samurai had always believed that beauty was found not in decoration, but in clarity. That same belief shaped Japanese design, from the sliding doors of a tea house to the glowing screen of a modern phone. Every line, every shape, whispers the same message. Nothing unnecessary, everything deliberate. Even minimalism, which the world now calls modern, was born in those ancient temples, where emptiness was never absence. It was meaning made visible. When you stand before a simple Japanese garden, with its 3 stones and rippled sand, you are seeing the spirit of the sword, translated into stillness. The restraint that once held back a killing blow now holds back excess. The discipline that once built warriors now builds balance. One could argue that Japan's obsession with mastery, from cuisine to technology, comes directly from the ghosts of the samurai. The sushi chef who spends a decade learning to make rice, the potter who rejects 100 bowls to keep one, the calligrapher who breathes once before every stroke. These are not eccentricities. They are devotion. And devotion for the samurai was a form of love. Love for the task. Love for the craft. Love for the act of doing something completely. To them, mastery was not about achievement. It was about alignment. The moment where self disappears into motion, where effort becomes art. That is mushin, the empty mind, the quiet behind the noise. And it still guides every hand that moves with care. Every artist who forgets themselves in the act of creation. In the world beyond Japan, the fascination with the samurai never faded. Western writers romanticized them. Filmmakers reimagined them. Philosophers quoted them. They became the symbols of stoicism, self-control, and purpose. But few understood that what truly made them powerful was not the sword, but the silence between strikes, that pause, that space, that awareness. It's something modern life almost fears, the moment without noise, the calm before an action, the calm after. It was there that truth lived. Even now, you can see it in martial arts. Before a judoka throws, before a kendo fighter strikes, there's always that stillness, that single heartbeat where time holds its breath. That is not hesitation. It is respect for the opponent, for the art, for life itself. The samurai's influence even reached into the global language of mindfulness. People speak now of being present, aware, deliberate, but those are old lessons, ancient ones. Zen monks taught them to samurai. Samurai lived them through discipline, and today the world rediscovers them as meditation. A samurai polishing his blade under moonlight is no different from a modern person sitting cross-legged before a candle. Both are trying to make the outside match the inside, to clear the rust from thought, the dust from intention, to see things as they are, without distortion. The weapons have changed. The practice remains. In the years after modernization, as Japan became a technological titan, people began to fear that the old spirit was fading. But look closer. Even in neon and steel, the heart of Bushido still beats. In the way a train conductor bows to passengers, in the way a shopkeeper hands back change with both hands, in the way a child bows before a teacher. The gestures may seem small, but they are enormous in meaning. They say, I see you, I respect you, I am aware of the space between us. And that awareness, so subtle, so constant, is the last great gift of the samurai. The idea that life is not a competition, but a conversation, that every interaction is sacred, even the briefest one. Even in the global fascination with Japanese art, film, and architecture, the samurai linger. When you watch a Kurosawa film, you are not just seeing swords and rain. You are seeing an entire philosophy of framing, timing, patience. The scenes breathe. They pause. They wait for the viewer to arrive. That patience, that rhythm, is the old discipline translated into cinema. In every brushstroke of Hokusai, every shadow of Mizoguchi, every photograph of a temple reflected in a pond, the same rule applies. Stillness is not the absence of movement. It is the perfection of it. That is why samurai films feel meditative, even when violent, because they are not about fighting. They are about balance, about the eternal dance between action and awareness. The samurai also reshaped how the world thought about honor. In most places, honor meant reputation, but for them, it meant alignment between action and spirit. You could lose everything: wealth, title, name, and still have honor. As long as your intention was pure, your heart steady. In modern Japan, that has become integrity, the quiet pride of doing your work well even when no one is watching. You see it in the custodians who polish subway floors until they shine, in the engineers who apologize publicly for a 2-minute train delay. To the outside world, it seems excessive. To Japan, it is natural, because to them, even small duties deserve reverence, and that reverence is the truest descendant of Bushido. Sometimes I think, if a samurai were to walk through Tokyo today, he might not recognize the machines, the skyscrapers, or the sound of airplanes crossing the sky. But he would recognize the rhythm, the way the street cleaners sweep in sync, the way the shops open with bows, the way the day unfolds with a kind of quiet choreography. He would stop, smile, and realize that his way of life never truly ended. It simply changed uniforms. Steel armor became pressed linen. And that, perhaps, is the truest victory of all. A legacy that does not need monuments, because it has become manner, in a way. The world still longs for its own samurai, not men of war, but men of principle. People who live deliberately, who do not rush, who give their full presence to whatever stands before them. That is why the image of the samurai never fades. Because in our restless modernity, we miss what they practiced daily. The art of slowing down, of mastering not others, but ourselves, of finding silence not in retreat, but in awareness. The samurai remind us that control is not suppression, it is clarity. That purpose is not loud, it is consistent. And that peace is simply discipline without violence. Even outside Japan, the samurai spirit has found strange new homes. In martial arts schools from Brazil to Berlin, in minimalist architects, in stoic philosophers, in surgeons who practice the same steady breath before a delicate cut. They may not know the word Bushido, but they live it. That is how philosophy survives, not through preservation, but through practice. The samurai never wanted to be remembered. They wanted to be refined. And the world unknowingly continues their work. Every time someone chooses patience over pride, every time someone moves with grace under pressure, a little piece of that ancient discipline breathes again. When the last light fades from a Kyoto garden and the city hums in the distance, you can almost feel the layers of time overlap. A phone glows, a temple bell rings. modern and ancient, present and eternal. It all blends into one long breath, and in that breath, if you listen closely, you'll hear it. The whisper of cloth, the soft echo of a bow, the promise of attention. That is all the samurai ever wanted to preserve. Not dominance, not rule, but awareness. The stillness between actions, the respect between people, the beauty between words. The world remembers them as warriors, but their greatest war was not with others. It was with themselves. To remain calm in chaos, honest in temptation, humble in triumph. That is the battle every human still fights. And perhaps that is why their story endures. Because the world still needs what they became. Not soldiers, but stewards. Not heroes, but humans aware of how fragile meaning truly is. The samurai's final gift to the world was not their armor or their poems. It was their way of living each moment as though it mattered completely. Even now, centuries later, we feel that call to move slower, to mean what we say, to bow before something greater than ourselves. They remind us that peace is not given. It is built, and that the art of being alive begins with the same silence that once fell before every duel. A breath, a pause, a choice. That is where mastery begins, and that is where the samurai still live. If you rise before dawn in Kyoto, the city is not yet awake. The lanterns hang dimly in the mist. The air smells faintly of stone and rain. And somewhere, a temple bell begins its low, steady pulse. It is not a sound so much as a reminder that even time itself bows before awareness. The monks open the doors of the old temples. They sweep the courtyards in slow arcs, the brooms whispering against gravel. That rhythm, that hush, is centuries old. A samurai once walked here, perhaps this very path, before a battle, before a vow, before an ending. He would have felt the same air, the same weight of silence. And though the sword has long turned to rust, the discipline remains. Every movement of the monk, the brush against the floor, the turning of the broom, is the same devotion, stripped of weapon, stripped of glory. This is how the samurai live on, not through memory, but through repetition, through the act of doing one small thing completely. In another corner of the country, a potter kneels before his wheel. The clay spins slowly, his hands steady, his breath in sync with the turning. He shapes not a vessel, but an idea. He is not thinking about the samurai. Yet he is them, because what he practices is what they worshipped. Attention, patience, humility before process. He does not hurry the clay. He listens to it. He does not force perfection. He coaxes it. And when the bowl is done, he does not keep it. He lets it go. Because all things, even beauty, must pass. That, too, was Bushido. Sometimes, I imagine the spirit of a samurai wandering through this modern world, not as a ghost of sadness, but as a silent witness. He would walk through neon streets, through bullet trains and glass towers. He would see people staring into screens, rushing, forgetting to breathe. And perhaps he would smile, not because he pitied them, but because he recognized the same restless heart, the same longing for focus, for stillness, for meaning. He would not raise his sword. He would simply stop. Stand still in the middle of the crowd, and for a moment, everything around him would seem to slow. That single moment of awareness, that pause, that is the invisible mark the samurai left upon the human world. Their story is often told as tragedy, the fall of a noble order, but endings are never really endings, are they? They are transformations. Every blade they forged, every bow they tied, every line of calligraphy they drew, all of it became a seed, planted deep in the soil of time, and from those seeds grew something larger, the art of balance, the worship of detail, the reverence for impermanence. When a cherry blossom falls, it does not mourn its own death. It completes the tree's purpose. So too did the samurai. They did not vanish. They simply bloomed, and the petals of their way of life scattered into everything that came after. There is something achingly beautiful in that, isn't there? That an entire civilization's discipline could dissolve into the fabric of ordinary life. That the sound of a train door closing could carry the same precision as the drawing of a sword. That the bow before entering a classroom could carry the same reverence as one before battle. The world changes its tools, but not its essence. We are all still learning the same lesson: to be aware, to act with purpose, to live without waste. These are the quiet commandments that survived the fall of the shogun. They require no shrine, no scripture, only presence. When the West discovered Japan's old art forms, they called them minimalist, aesthetic, exotic. But to the samurai, there was nothing aesthetic about it. It was survival, a way to keep the mind steady amid impermanence, a way to give shape to the invisible, the curve of a tea bowl, the placement of a stone, the fold of a robe. Each one was a form of meditation. Even death was not feared. It was just another motion in a larger pattern. They did not seek immortality. They sought harmony. And perhaps that is why they achieved both. In the quiet halls of the Tokyo National Museum, rows of armor sit behind glass, the colors faded, the silk worn thin, the steel dulled by time. Visitors whisper, cameras click. But if you look closely, if you really look, you'll see something more than history. You'll see the perfection of intent, the symmetry of design, the patience of hands that believed in eternity even while living for the moment. Each piece was made not to impress, but to endure, not to shine, but to serve. Even the dents and scratches are stories, each one a reminder that beauty is never separate from struggle. And that is perhaps the truest thing the samurai ever taught, that grace is forged, not found. Outside, a soft rain begins. The museum windows fog slightly, and for a moment, the world blurs. And in that blur, it feels as though past and present are touching fingertips. Because every drop of rain that falls on Tokyo has fallen on Kyoto, and on Kamakura, and on the battlefield of Sekigahara. It is the same rain, the same rhythm, the same patient hand washing the earth clean. It does not care who won, who ruled, who died. It only continues. And in that continuation, there is peace. That too is Bushido, in its purest form. The refusal to stop existing, even when your form has changed. Perhaps that is the most comforting thought, that nothing truly ends. It only transforms. The sword becomes a brush. The brush becomes a gesture. The gesture becomes a way of being. And the way of being becomes a whisper passed from generation to generation. We live surrounded by things the samurai would never recognize, but inside us, there is something they would, the longing for calm, the hunger for purpose, the wish to be remembered, not for wealth, but for how well we did what we were meant to do. That longing, that wish, that stillness is the blade we all carry now, invisible, but sharp. And when life grows loud, when your mind feels pulled in 1,000 directions, perhaps it helps to remember them. The warriors who sat before dawn in meditation, who practiced a single motion until it became breathing, who treated even their own death as a lesson in grace. They lived by one truth. That mastery is not control, it is surrender. The ability to let go of fear, expectation, and ego, and simply do the thing before you. completely, without hesitation, without noise. That was the art of the samurai. And it is the art the world still needs. In the end, the samurai were never just men with swords. They were poets of awareness. Their weapon was focus. Their armor was patience. Their battle was with distraction. And their victory was balance. So tonight, as you rest, and the sound of your breath evens out, think of them not as distant warriors, but as companions across time, men who learned through hardship and devotion what it means to be present. You don't need a temple to meet them. You only need a moment of quiet, a breath taken without hurry, a task done without resentment, a thought allowed to pass without clinging. That is Bushido, stripped of legend, returned to simplicity. In the gentle dark, as the night folds softly around you, imagine standing at the edge of an old garden. The lanterns are low. The wind moves through bamboo. The scent of rain and stone fills the air. Somewhere nearby, a bell rings once, and for that single sound, everything stops. The world holds its breath, and you realize this is what the samurai sought, not victory, but stillness, not immortality, but meaning, not glory, but grace. And though their footsteps have long faded, their lesson remains: to live as though every motion were sacred and every silence eternal. So rest now. The story has ended, but the echo continues. You are part of that echo, part of a lineage that reaches beyond blood and time. The same awareness that once guided a sword can guide your hand, your word, your breath. You do not need to fight to live with purpose. You only need to see, to feel, to act with care. The world does not need more warriors. It needs more awareness. And that is the truest inheritance of the samurai. They showed us that even in the smallest act, when done with reverence, there is eternity. The night deepens, the air cools, and the last whisper of the old world folds into the new. A temple bell rings again, distant, fading. You are not alone. You are simply continuing a rhythm that began centuries ago. One that says, be still, breathe, and bow to the moment. Because in that moment, all time meets. And in that silence, the samurai live forever.